The spotlight crowned Clark Gable as Hollywood's king, yet his grin concealed arrogance that ruined his co-stars. Mickey Rooney's all-American boy act unraveled into raging cruelty, and Bing Crosby's velvet lullabies calmed a nation even as he terrified his own children. These weren't always idols, but imposters. Today, we expose 18 actors and legends, where glamour often hid cruelty, betrayal, and the darker side of fame. Number 1. Clark Gable, Hollywood's king with a cruel streak. The lights blazed at MGM's soundstage, and Clark Gable strode in with that unmistakable grin, the grin that sold millions of tickets. But behind the smile lay a man who treated charm as a weapon, leaving more than one co-star in tears before the cameras even rolled. To the public, he was the king of Hollywood, yet those who worked closest with him knew the crown was forged in arrogance and cruelty. Born in 1901, Gable clawed his way up from bit parts until MGM's publicity machine crowned him their leading man. Women adored him, men wanted to be him, but away from the screen, whispers followed him through every studio lot. Loretta Young never forgot the moment during a 1935 production when Gable's advances left her shaken, and soon after, she disappeared from Hollywood gossip pages, only to return months later with a mysterious illness that turned out to be the birth of a child. Gossip columnists hinted, but the studio silenced the truth, filing it away in MGM's iron vaults. On set, Gable's dominance often turned to bullying. During the filming of Gone with the Wind in 1939, co-stars quietly complained of his temper and impatience. Even Vivien Leigh admitted she feared his moods, describing him as a man who could turn thunderous in an instant. Directors weren't spared either. Gable had little tolerance for authority. He clashed with Frank Capra during It Happened One Night and later lorded his star power over younger actors, belittling those who couldn't keep pace with him. His private life was equally stormy. Infidelity was no secret. He flaunted affairs in an era when the Hays Code demanded actors portray morality on screen. Carole Lombard, the great love of his life, endured his wandering eye even as gossip columnists painted them as Hollywood's golden couple. After her tragic death in 1942, many claimed Gable's grief was genuine, but friends whispered it was guilt that kept him awake at night. Audiences never saw the sneer behind the smile, the cold dismissal behind the warm laugh. And as the studio tightened the spotlight on his crown, Clark Gable wore it like armor, sharp, heavy, and ready to cut. Number 2. Mickey Rooney, the wholesome boy who became a tyrant. The cameras loved him, a boy with sparkling eyes, mischief in his grin, and a voice that seemed to belong to every American family. But once the lights dimmed, Mickey Rooney's charm curdled into cruelty, and the wholesome child of MGM revealed a temper as sharp as broken glass. Born Joseph Ewell Jr. in 1920, Rooney was pushed onto the stage before he could read. MGM molded him into the eternal boy, the Andy Hardy, who embodied virtue for Depression-era audiences. To millions, he was a symbol of innocence. Behind the studio gates, he was a storm no one wanted to endure. Crew members described him as volatile, quick to insults, and prone to humiliating colleagues in front of entire sets. He wielded his fame like a weapon, belittling those with less power and reminding everyone that MGM had crowned him the top box office draw of 1939. But the real fractures came when his wholesome image clashed with his private appetites. Rumors swirled through gossip columns, affairs with starlets twice his age, outbursts that left young co-stars shaken, and nights of reckless indulgence that MGM's press department buried beneath glowing headlines. In 1944, during National Velvet, his treatment of a teenage Elizabeth Taylor drew sharp whispers around the lot. While the studio silenced scandal, Taylor never forgot the contempt he later showed in interviews, where he dismissed her talent and mocked her fame. Rooney's personal life was a carousel of chaos. 8 marriages, each one collapsing under infidelity, cruelty, or his raging need to control. Friends spoke of his volcanic temper, his habit of tearing into waiters, secretaries, even lifelong confidants. Financial ruin followed him too. Despite earning millions, he squandered fortunes on gambling tables and fleeting pleasures, begging for loans long after the glory years had faded. On screen, he remained forever youthful, the boy who never grew up. Off-screen, he became a man trapped in bitterness, resenting those who surpassed him and punishing anyone within reach. The irony lingered heavy. The smiling boy who once embodied innocence became the tyrant who destroyed it. Number 3, Bing Crosby, the velvet voice that silenced his children. The microphone glowed red, and Bing Crosby's velvet baritone poured through American living rooms like warm brandy at Christmas. To the public, he was the voice of comfort, the face of stability in the darkest days of the Depression and the Second World War. But inside his own home, Crosby's voice carried a different tone, sharp, punishing, and impossible to escape. By the late 1930s, Crosby was more than a star. He was an empire. Paramount Pictures relied on him for box office gold, while Decca Records and radio audiences made him one of the most recognizable entertainers in the world. He perfected an image of genial ease, the relaxed crooner who made singing look effortless. Yet his children remembered a man obsessed with discipline. Gary Crosby, his eldest, later revealed how mealtimes could feel like interrogations, with his father's rules enforced through fear rather than love. The irony was cruel. America's most reassuring father figure on screen left his real children terrified behind closed doors. Part of Crosby's obsession came from his own anxieties about Hollywood. He had watched too many star children fall into ruin and was determined his sons would not follow that path. His solution was not kindness, but severity. Punishments were strict, emotions suppressed, affection rarely given. The Crosby household echoed with silence as heavy as any orchestra pause. As the years passed, the public saw only the triumphs, White Christmas becoming the best-selling single of all time, his easy banter with Bob Hope in the Road Pictures, his golf course charm that made presidents lean in close. But within the family, wounds deepened. Gary Crosby's memoir painted the home as a cold fortress, where music never softened the edge of discipline. When Crosby collapsed on a golf course in Madrid in 1977, his last words were about the game, not his family. The man who had given the world its most enduring lullabies left his own children without comfort, their voices carrying stories he never wanted the public to hear. And so the crooner who once soothed a nation left behind echoes that were anything but gentle. Number 4, Wallace Beery, the studio's brutal enforcer. The roar of MGM's lion filled the theater, and Wallace Beery's face appeared. The lovable oaf, the gruff everyman with a heart of gold. Audiences adored him, but backstage, the mask slipped. On set, Beery's fists were quicker than his smile, and his reputation for cruelty became one of Hollywood's darkest open secrets. Beery's rise was carefully engineered. By the 1930s, Louis B. Mayer positioned him as a box office anchor, pairing him with child stars to soften his grizzled image. Films like The Champ, 1931, earned him acclaim as a rough but tender father figure. Yet the children who worked beside him often felt something different: fear. Mickey Rooney once revealed that Beery, who played his mentor on screen, was brutal in private, cuffing him around and reducing him to tears when cameras weren't rolling. The whispers didn't end there. Gloria Swanson, the silent screen goddess, recounted her own chilling encounter with Beery years earlier. In her memoirs, she described their wedding night in 1916 as a nightmare, claiming his cruelty left scars that lingered long after the brief marriage collapsed. MGM brushed the story aside, protecting its star while tarnishing Swanson as difficult. It was the studio's way, silence the women, shield the men. Beery's temper wasn't confined to private moments. On set, he bullied extras, mocked young actors, and once, according to crew lore, punched a fellow performer so hard that the man had to be carried off set. Directors tolerated it because audiences still lined up, and MGM feared nothing more than losing a bankable star during the Depression years. Even Beery's public image carried a hint of menace. Tall, lumbering, with a heavy scowl, he looked less like a matinee idol and more like a gangster. That aura worked wonders in the pictures, but it mirrored his reality too closely. By the 1940s, Beery's box office clout was fading. Yet the stories of his violence never dimmed. When the lights went out and the audiences applauded, few imagined that Hollywood's lovable brute was far more brute than lovable, a man whose shadow loomed larger than the lion that roared before his films. Number 5. Errol Flynn, swashbuckler with a sinister reputation. The sword clashed against steel, cameras rolled, and Errol Flynn flashed the grin that made him Hollywood's ultimate rogue. Audiences saw a dashing hero, the pirate who leapt from rigging ropes with effortless grace. But when the curtain fell, Flynn's swagger followed him into real life and left a trail of scandal so dark it nearly ended his career. Born in Tasmania in 1909, Flynn lived a life as wild as any script. Expelled from schools, chased from jobs, he drifted through New Guinea as an adventurer, smuggler, and wanderer before washing up in Hollywood. Warner Brothers saw in him a ready-made star, tall, handsome, dangerous, and Captain Blood, 1935, turned him overnight into a sensation. Yet the same appetite that drove his on-screen bravado burned recklessly off-screen. By the early 1940s, gossip columnists had a field day chronicling Flynn's endless affairs, his reckless parties, and his disdain for propriety. Hollywood insiders whispered that he mocked the very studios that paid him, openly declaring he could charm his way out of anything. For a time, it seemed true. Directors indulged him, co-stars forgave him, audiences adored him. But in 1942, his name became front-page scandal when young women accused him of impropriety at wild gatherings. The case ignited headlines across the country, with reporters camping outside Warner Brothers' gates. The trial that followed gripped the nation, threatening to topple Flynn's stardom. Studio fixers and lawyers worked overtime, spinning the narrative that the charges were nothing more than opportunists trying to take down a hero. Flynn was acquitted, but his reputation never fully recovered. For years, the phrase "in like Flynn" carried a shadow that fans only half understood. Even after the trial, Flynn seemed determined to live as though danger itself was his co-star. He drank heavily, pursued younger women, and mocked morality while playing the gallant rogue on screen. By the time of his death in 1959 at just 50, he looked decades older, his face etched by indulgence and regret. The man who had embodied Hollywood adventure left behind not the image of a hero, but of a pirate who plundered until there was nothing left but scandal. Number 6. Joan Crawford, the glamour queen who ruled with terror. The chandeliers sparkled above her Beverly Hills living room, and Joan Crawford sat beneath it like a queen upon her throne, every hair in place, every cushion aligned, every guest trembling under her gaze. Hollywood celebrated her as the ultimate rags-to-riches story, but those who crossed her path remembered something colder, a woman who wielded glamour like a blade. Born Lucille Fay LeSueur in 1904, Crawford remade herself through sheer willpower. MGM polished her into a jazz-age sensation, a flapper goddess whose sharp cheekbones and hungry ambition mirrored the decade itself. By the 1930s, she had become one of the studio's most bankable stars, a rival to Norma Shearer and Greta Garbo. But while the public adored her elegance, colleagues knew the truth. Crawford ruled with terror, and nothing was ever good enough. Her obsession with perfection bordered on mania. She demanded spotless sets, spotless costumes, spotless children. Maids spoke of nights when she prowled her home with white gloves, checking for dust like a general inspecting barracks. Actors recalled her icy fury when lines weren't delivered to her liking, or when lights failed to flatter her features. One co-star admitted he dreaded the moment Crawford would tilt her head and whisper, "Fix it," a command that sent grips, cameramen, and even directors scrambling. Crawford's rivalries were legendary. Her feud with Bette Davis on Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. 1962 turned the set into a battlefield. Davis accused Crawford of sabotaging scenes, and Crawford, in turn, accused Davis of violence during takes. The tension was so fierce that gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper wrote daily dispatches, feeding audiences a drama more gripping than the film itself. But it was within her family that Crawford's reign turned darkest. Adopted children later described a household of iron rules and sudden punishments, where glamour masked cruelty and affection was rationed like wartime sugar. Even as Crawford accepted her Academy Award in 1946, she did so from her bed, feigning illness to steal the spotlight from competitors. Hollywood had crowned her its most glamorous star, but beneath the crown was steel, sharp, unbending, and merciless to anyone who dared fall out of line. Number 7. Kirk Douglas, the hero with a dark shadow. The camera caught him bare-chested, chained to the oars in Spartacus. Veins straining, jaw set, eyes burning with defiance. To audiences, Kirk Douglas was the ultimate hero, the man who broke chains and defied empires. But off-screen, those same steel eyes could turn menacing, and his hunger for control left co-stars and lovers alike in fear of his shadow. Born Isur Danielovich in 1916, Douglas rose from the poverty of immigrant streets to become one of Hollywood's most commanding presences. His climb was a testament to grit, Broadway stages, minor roles, then a contract with Warner Brothers before carving out his kingdom at MGM. Yet as his fame soared, stories circulated through gossip pages and whispered studio corridors. Douglas was brilliant, but he was also impossible. On set, directors learned to tread carefully. During Paths of Glory, 1957, Douglas challenged Stanley Kubrick at every turn, second-guessing shots and demanding changes. His temper during Spartacus was so volcanic, he fired the original director after only a week. To colleagues, he seemed less a star than a general, running the production with an iron grip. But it was his private life that cast the darkest clouds. Infidelities were endless, with Douglas himself later admitting to betraying nearly every partner he had. His marriage to Diana Dill dissolved under the weight of his affairs, and even Carole Lombard was rumored to have warned friends about his domineering nature long before his fame exploded. More sinister whispers followed him too. Rumors of encounters with vulnerable young actresses, stories that studios buried deep under contracts and publicity campaigns. In interviews, Douglas tried to cloak it all in charm, confessing with a smirk that he was perhaps the most unpopular man in Hollywood. Burt Lancaster once joked that working with him was like wrestling a tiger, but the laughter never fully disguised the truth. Douglas's appetite for power and control often left others scarred. Hollywood immortalized him as the liberator who shouted, "I am Spartacus." Yet those who knew him privately felt another truth, that Kirk Douglas chained others to his will long before the cameras ever rolled. Number 8. Henry Fonda, the American everyman with a hollow heart. The dust swirled around his boots in the grapes of wrath, and Henry Fonda's voice trembled with conviction as he promised justice for the downtrodden. To audiences, he was the very soul of America. Noble, steadfast, the conscience of a nation. But away from the cameras, Fonda's silence cut sharper than words, and those closest to him learned that the man who played virtue so effortlessly could be colder than stone. Born in 1905 in Nebraska, Fonda carried a Midwestern plainness that directors adored. John Ford made him a legend, casting him as Tom Joad in 1940, and Hollywood quickly anointed him the face of decency. Yet within his marriages and family, the man who embodied compassion on screen seemed incapable of tenderness. Jane and Peter Fonda both recalled a father who was distant, emotionally absent, a man who preferred solitude over intimacy. Jane once admitted she spent her life trying to earn a smile that rarely came. Romance fared no better. Fonda moved through 5 marriages, each unraveling under betrayal and neglect. His first wife, Margaret Sullivan, accused him of emotional coldness, her own despair echoing through Hollywood gossip. Affairs with Joan Crawford, Marlene Dietrich, and Barbara Stanwyck filled the pages of columnists, painting a picture not of the faithful husband he played, but of a man endlessly restless, never satisfied. Colleagues admired his craft but found him aloof. On set, he could be cordial, even kind, but never warm. Darryl Zanuck once remarked that Fonda acted like a saint on film and a ghost at home. Even in later years, when he appeared in 12 Angry Men, 1957, his piercing moral authority was hailed as iconic, yet his own children described a father they barely knew. When illness finally weakened him in the early 1980s, Jane and Peter sat at his bedside, aching for words of affection that never came. Fonda's eyes, the same ones that had once carried a nation's conscience, remained fixed on the distance, as though even at the end, America's everyman was playing a role, leaving those who loved him most outside the frame. Number 9. Bette Davis, the Queen of Feuds. The clack of her heels echoed through Warner Brothers corridors, and crew members braced themselves. When Bette Davis entered a room, sparks followed. On screen, she was electrifying, eyes like searchlights cutting through the smoke of a 1930s nightclub scene. Off-screen, those same eyes narrowed into daggers, and feuds became her second career. Davis burst onto the scene in the early 1930s, clawing her way up from forgettable bit parts until Of Human Bondage, 1934, made her a sensation. By the late 30s, she was Warner Brothers' crown jewel, winning 2 Oscars and demanding scripts that matched her ferocity. But with power came enemies. She quarreled with Jack Warner himself, suing the studio in 1937 for slavery contracts, a move that nearly destroyed her career, but cemented her as Hollywood's most unyielding rebel. Her rivalries with other actresses were legendary. With Miriam Hopkins, sparks flew during Old Acquaintance, 1943, where Davis's contempt boiled over so visibly that gossip columnists joked the film needed no script, just a referee. But nothing matched her war with Joan Crawford when the two were cast in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, 1962. Their off-screen hatred turned every scene into high drama. Crawford claimed Davis deliberately injured her during filming. Davis accused Crawford of sabotaging shots by stuffing her pockets with weights during a dragging scene. Hedda Hopper's column feasted on the feud, printing every barbed insult like a serialized novel. Davis's sharp tongue spared no one. She dismissed Errol Flynn as a beautiful corpse, mocked Katharine Hepburn's clipped voice, and once quipped that she'd rather be buried with her Oscar than with any of her husbands. Even directors found her impossible. William Wyler adored her talent, but admitted working with her felt like wrestling a wildcat. Yet beneath the wit and venom lay an iron will to survive in a business that chewed up women and spat them out. Davis fought not just for herself, but to stay relevant in an industry terrified of aging actresses. And so, long after her rivals faded, she remained, eyes blazing, tongue sharpened, the queen who turned every set into a battlefield. Number 10. Orson Welles, the genius who despised everyone. The reel clicked, the projector whirred, and a young Orson Welles filled the screen with Citizen Kane, a masterpiece so bold it left critics breathless. At just 25, he had rewritten the language of cinema. But while audiences saw genius, his colleagues saw arrogance so blistering, It scorched every friendship he touched. Welles's rise was meteoric. From the Mercury Theater in New York to the infamous War of the Worlds broadcast in 1938, he seemed untouchable. RKO Pictures handed him unprecedented control, and he delivered Citizen Kane, 1941, a film whispered to be an attack on publishing titan William Randolph Hearst. The backlash was brutal, but the legend of Orson Welles was born. Behind the brilliance, however, lay contempt. Welles's private conversations, captured years later on tapes with director Henry Jaglom, revealed scathing opinions about nearly every star in Hollywood. He mocked Laurence Olivier as dim, dismissed Spencer Tracy as overrated, and sneered that Bette Davis was unbearable to watch. On set, Welles demanded loyalty but gave little in return. His grand visions often collapsed under his inability to compromise. After The Magnificent Ambersons, 1942, RKO recut the film without him, furious at his extravagance. Rather than fight, Welles disappeared to South America, leaving behind a gutted masterpiece and a trail of bitter producers. It became a pattern: dazzling projects, unfinished dreams, scorched bridges. Actors who worked with him spoke of manipulation and humiliation. He often overshadowed co-stars with bombastic performances, refusing to yield even in ensemble casts. He charmed journalists, yet the same wit turned venomous when their backs were turned. Even his allies admitted they feared his tongue more than any critic's review. By the 1970s, Welles had become a ghost haunting talk shows, larger in body and ego than in influence. He spun endless tales of past glories while ridiculing the very industry that once hailed him a prodigy. Hollywood crowned him a visionary, but his genius came wrapped in disdain. And as his laughter echoed through late-night interviews, one could hear the bite beneath it, the sound of a man who would rather burn bridges than ever bow. Number 11. Peter Lorre, the haunting face with disturbing habits. The spotlight hit his bulging eyes, and Peter Lorre's whisper slithered across the theater, sending chills through audiences. In 1931, that unforgettable face made him a star of nightmares. But those who knew him off-screen found his eccentricities just as unsettling as the villains he portrayed. Born in Austria-Hungary in 1904, Lorre carried old-world shadows with him to Hollywood. After fleeing Nazi Germany, he landed in America and quickly became Warner Brothers' favorite creep, playing sinister doctors, spies, and criminals. His voice, that slow, eerie murmur, made him a staple of suspense films. Yet behind the camera, his private demons became legendary. He battled chronic insomnia and relied heavily on sedatives that left him erratic. Studio insiders whispered that he sometimes wandered sets, half dreaming, mumbling to himself, searching for a calm he never found. His habits unnerved co-stars. During long shoots, he would pull colleagues aside to describe bizarre medical procedures he claimed to have researched, as if rehearsing for one of his twisted roles. Humphrey Bogart, who worked with him in The Maltese Falcon, 1941, and Casablanca, 1942, joked that Lorre lived as though he never left the role, but the humor carried unease. Lorre's personal relationships fared no better. Marriages fractured under the weight of his addictions and his unpredictable moods. Friends recounted how dinner parties could turn macabre, with Lorre suddenly launching into grotesque impressions or recounting grim tales of wartime horrors, until the table fell silent. Some claimed he kept odd collections of medical paraphernalia, a grim reflection of the mad doctors he so often played. Despite his disturbing quirks, studios kept casting him. His face sold tickets. His presence guaranteed unease. Yet as the 1950s arrived, his health collapsed. Bloated from years of chemical crutches, he became a ghost of his former self, drifting through B-movies and television cameos. Audiences remembered the chilling menace of his screen villains, but those who encountered him privately carried a different image. Peter Lorre, wandering through smoke-filled backlots, muttering to himself, half in character, half lost to the shadows he could never quite escape. Number 12. Fatty Arbuckle, the fallen clown of scandal. The champagne fizzed, the gramophone blared, and Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, the jolliest clown of silent films, held court in a San Francisco hotel suite. It was 1921, and Hollywood's most beloved funny man was at the height of his power, until that night ended in tragedy, and his laughter was forever drowned in scandal. Arbuckle had been Paramount's crown jewel, a giant of comedy, whose pratfalls rivaled Chaplin and Keaton. At $1 million a year, he was the highest-paid actor in the world, and audiences adored the way his bulk seemed to defy gravity as he danced across the screen. But with fame came excess. He was known for lavish parties that spilled into dawn, fueled by jazz-age indulgences and the reckless abandon of prohibition nights. That September, during a holiday gathering, actress Virginia Rappe collapsed under mysterious circumstances. The headlines the next morning were a bombshell. America's clown accused of a crime too unspeakable for the newspapers to print in detail. Gossip columnists like Luella Parsons and the Hearst Press painted Arbuckle as a monster. And though details remained murky, the nation demanded blood. The trials stretched across months, 3 in total. The first 2 ended in hung juries, the third with an acquittal. The jury even issued an apology, declaring Arbuckle innocent. Yet Hollywood was unforgiving. The scandal had already scorched his name beyond repair. His films were pulled from theaters, Paramount cut ties, and the Hays office made him an example in its crusade for morality. Arbuckle tried to return, directing under pseudonyms and attempting a comeback on stage. But the damage was permanent. Friends whispered that he was a broken man, hiding his sorrow behind forced laughter, leaning on bottles of bootleg whiskey to numb the ruin of his career. By the time he died in 1933, at just 46, he was a ghost of the star who had once made millions roar with joy. The circus lights had dimmed, and the clown who once ruled silent comedy was left with only silence, a silence heavier than any laughter he had ever earned. Number 13. Charles Laughton, the tormented tyrant. The spotlight hit his heavy face, and Charles Laughton bellowed across the stage, his voice booming like a cathedral bell. Audiences shivered at the force of it, but those who worked beside him knew the truth. Laughton's power didn't stop when the curtain fell. Behind closed doors, he became a tyrant who ruled through humiliation and fear. Born in England in 1899, Laughton stormed Hollywood in the 1930s, winning an Academy Award for the private life of Henry VIII, 1933. Studios clamored for his talent, casting him in Mutiny on the Bounty and Les Miserables. His presence was volcanic. Expressive eyes, thunderous voice, every gesture designed to dominate. But that same intensity, when turned inward, curdled into cruelty. Co-stars recalled the sting of his mockery, his habit of dissecting their performances in front of entire crews. "You'll never act again after this scene," he once sneered at a nervous extra, leaving the young man trembling. His marriage to Elsa Lanchester, famed for The Bride of Frankenstein, became another battlefield. She adored his genius, but endured his sharp tongue and volatile moods. Friends whispered of evenings where dinner descended into cutting insults, with Laughton relishing the discomfort he caused. His private torment only fueled the cruelty. His insecurities about appearance, his inability to reconcile with parts of himself, and his dependence on sedatives to dull the storms inside. Even when directing, he terrorized those around him. On the Night of the Hunter, 1955, his one and only film as director, crew members described him as both visionary and vicious, berating actors until they wept. Though the film later became a masterpiece, at the time its failure crushed him, leaving Laughton embittered, railing against critics and colleagues alike. By the late 1950s, he was a man at war with himself, brilliant on stage, poisonous in private. His performances could move audiences to tears, but his barbed words left scars on those who knew him personally. And so the same voice that thundered across stages and screens often echoed late at night, lashing out in fury, leaving only silence where love might have been. Number 14. John Barrymore. The great profile drowned in vice. The curtain rose, and the audience gasped. John Barrymore's face, the great profile, seemed chiseled from marble, his voice like rolling thunder. Women swooned, men envied him, and critics called him the greatest actor of his age. Yet while the stage immortalized him, the man behind it crumbled, drowning his brilliance in a flood of reckless indulgence. Born into the famed Barrymore dynasty, John carried theater in his blood. By the 1910s, he was Broadway royalty, and by the 1920s, Hollywood's cameras adored him. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1920, and Grand Hotel, 1932, showcased not only his looks, but a magnetic intensity that few could rival. But the role he played best was that of a tragic libertine. Gossip columnists filled pages with tales of all-night binges, broken marriages, and a hunger for pleasure that no stage could contain. His reputation for excess became as legendary as his talent. Directors dreaded his tardiness, or worse, his arrival in no condition to perform. On the set of Romeo and Juliet, 1936, co-stars whispered that Barrymore stumbled through rehearsals, often forgetting lines he once delivered with perfection. To hide his faltering memory, he carried cue cards on set, pretending they were scripts. Marriages fared no better. He wed 4 times, each ending in bitter collapse, with his charm giving way to cruelty once the vows were spoken. Lovers recalled a man capable of grand passion one night and withering contempt the next. His siblings, Lionel and Ethel Barrymore, tried to intervene, but John laughed off concern with the same bravado that made audiences adore him. By the 1940s, he had become a spectacle of decline, bloated, shaky. He was hired more for the punchline of his name than the weight of his talent. Orson Welles once remarked that seeing Barrymore late in life was like watching a monument fall apart. In 1942, he collapsed during a rehearsal and never recovered. The great profile, once the most beautiful face on the silver screen, was laid to rest, not with the dignity of a king, but with the bitter irony of a man undone by the very excesses that had defined his legend. Number 15. Milton Berle, Uncle Milty's ego, unleashed. The television flickered to life in living rooms across America. And there he was, Milton Berle, in an outrageous dress, prancing across the stage, making a nation laugh so hard that stores closed early on Tuesday nights. He was Mr. Television, the man who practically invented prime time. But behind the laughter, Berle's ego ballooned until it smothered everyone around him, leaving colleagues, writers, and even network executives seething in his shadow. Born in 1908, Berle had been a child vaudevillian before radio, and movies gave him modest fame, but it was television that transformed him into a national obsession. Texaco Star Theater made him the most recognizable entertainer in the country, with ratings so high that traffic dropped on nights he aired. NBC adored him, advertisers showered him with cash, and the public crowned him Uncle Milty. Yet with every laugh, his arrogance grew. Writers complained he stole jokes shamelessly, demanding credit for lines he hadn't written. Guest stars groaned at his need to dominate every sketch, mugging at the camera, dragging scenes past their breaking point, just to grab an extra laugh. Behind the curtain, his temper was notorious. He berated staff, mocked costume designers, and even once fired a stagehand in the middle of a live show for fumbling a prop. Hollywood insiders told stories of his relentless bragging, about ratings, about women, about his supposed legendary endowments. Gossip columnists like Walter Winchell fed the myth, but colleagues rolled their eyes at the endless self-promotion. By the time Saturday Night Live invited him to host in 1979, his ego had fully eclipsed his talent. Cast members were horrified at his refusal to follow direction. Lorne Michaels later called it one of the worst hosting disasters in the show's history. For audiences of the early 1950s, Uncle Milty was a joyous constant, a clown who brought laughter into the living room. But those who worked with him remembered something else, a tyrant whose need for attention was so consuming that even laughter itself wasn't enough. And when the lights dimmed, Milton Berle remained alone on stage, still performing, even if no one wanted to watch. Number 16. Peter Sellers, the mad genius of cruelty. The set of The Pink Panther rang with laughter, the bumbling Inspector Clouseau stumbling across the screen like a master of chaos. But when the director called cut, Peter Sellers dropped the mask, his eyes hardening, his voice turning sharp. The comedian who made the world laugh often made those closest to him weep. Born in 1925 to a family of vaudevillians, Sellers carried a genius for mimicry that catapulted him from radio's Goon Show to international stardom. By the 1960s, he was one of the most bankable stars in the world, transforming himself chameleon-like in Dr. Strangelove and Being There. Yet behind the brilliance, his moods swung like a pendulum, leaving collaborators walking on eggshells. Blake Edwards, who directed him in multiple Pink Panther films, called Sellers both a genius and a monster, recalling days when the actor refused to speak directly to him, communicating only through assistants. His cruelty extended into his personal life. Sellers married 4 times, each ending in heartbreak. Britt Eklund, his second wife, described nights of charm that dissolved into sudden explosions of rage, with Sellers hurling insults that cut deeper than any blade. Friends claimed he could shift personalities mid-conversation, from affectionate to vicious, from playful to paranoid, as though the roles he played on screen bled uncontrollably into reality. Obsessed with his health and gripped by insecurities, Sellers often turned to sedatives and secret injections prescribed by questionable doctors. These fueled his erratic behavior, heightening paranoia and volatility. On set, he could deliver a performance of staggering brilliance in the morning, then storm off in the afternoon, threatening to quit productions altogether. Studios tolerated it because his films made millions, but crew members remembered the terror of his tirades long after the laughter faded. By the 1970s, Sellers was both legend and liability. His body weakened by years of indulgence, his spirit corroded by inner demons. Yet when the cameras rolled, he conjured genius from the wreckage, and as the lights went dark, those who knew him best were left with the image of a man consumed, not by the characters he played, but by the cruelty he could never leave behind. Number 17. Oliver Reed, the drunken monster of set and stage. The pub doors swung wide, and in barreled Oliver Reed, shirt half open, fists clenched, eyes gleaming with mischief. Within minutes, glasses shattered, chairs scraped, and the room trembled under his booming laugh. He lived every night like a performance, but one with no director to call cut. Born in 1938, Reed carried the rugged charm that defined British cinema of the 1960s. Hammer Studios made him a cult figure in Gothic horror, and his breakout in Oliver, 1968, catapulted him to international fame. Hollywood eyed him for superstardom. Yet Reed's appetites eclipsed his talent. He drank with a fury that turned bars into battlefields, once boasting he could down 100 pints in a marathon session. Stories of his escapades filled gossip columns from London to Los Angeles. Fist fights with strangers, naked dashes through hotel lobbies, and wild nights that left entire film crews scrambling to contain the chaos. On set, his unpredictability became infamous. During Women in Love, 1969, Reed shocked co-stars with his intensity. both in front of the camera and off, where he picked fights and terrorized assistants. Directors described him as magnetic in the morning, monstrous by nightfall, a man whose performances burned white-hot before collapsing into drunken rage. Richard Burton and Richard Harris, heavy drinkers themselves, even admitted Reed made them look tame by comparison. His private life fared no better. Lovers endured his violent mood swings, and friends spoke of his need to dominate every room. He turned interviews into spectacles, once stripping on live television and challenging hosts to drinking contests. What audiences laughed off as antics left colleagues shaken. Reed seemed determined to burn through his body and reputation with equal speed. By the 1980s, his career drifted into B-movies, but his notoriety never faded. When he died in 1999 after collapsing in a Maltese bar during the filming of Gladiator, it seemed a cruel inevitability. Hollywood mourned the loss of a great actor, but those who had seen his rampages remembered something darker. The monster who had long ago traded discipline for chaos, leaving only wreckage in his wake. Number 18. Gloria Swanson. The diva who devoured everything. The velvet curtains parted, and Gloria Swanson descended the grand staircase, jewels glittering, eyes blazing, every inch the goddess Hollywood demanded. Yet as she swept through the crowd, colleagues whispered of something voracious beneath the diamonds. A diva whose appetite for power, men, and control left nothing untouched. Born in 1899, Swanson was plucked from obscurity by Mack Sennett's comedy shorts, only to reinvent herself at Paramount as the epitome of glamour. Cecil B. DeMille draped her in silks and furs, casting her as queens and temptresses in spectacles like Male and Female, 1919. By the 1920s, she was silent cinema's reigning empress, her face on fan magazines from coast to coast. But Swanson's rise came with a reputation for devouring those who stood in her way. Her marriages unraveled like discarded costumes. 6 in total, each marred by betrayal, affairs, and scandals splashed across gossip columns. Lovers and husbands alike told tales of her domineering will, her refusal to yield to anyone's authority. Joseph Kennedy, the powerful patriarch of the Kennedy clan, became both her financier and lover during the 1920s, funding her ill-fated epic Queen Kelly. The affair nearly toppled his political ambitions, while Swanson walked away with her reputation sharpened, if not entirely intact. On set, her demands became legendary. She insisted on the most extravagant gowns, the grandest lighting, the fullest attention from directors. Cameramen whispered that Swanson could halt production for hours over a misplaced shadow on her cheek. Fellow actresses, from Clara Bow to Norma Shearer, complained that competing with Swanson meant competing with a hurricane, one that chewed up co-stars and left the spotlight fixed squarely on her. Her legend found its ultimate irony in Sunset Boulevard, 1950, where she played Norma Desmond, the forgotten star still hungry for adoration. Audiences gasped at the performance, wondering where fiction ended and truth began. As she whispered, "All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up." It was as though Swanson herself confessed the truth. The diva who had once devoured everything had finally been consumed by her own myth. Hollywood's golden age sparkled with diamonds and champagne. Yet behind every marquee lay shadows no spotlight could erase. These stars were worshipped on screen, but their private lives told darker tales of power, cruelty, and broken dreams. Which of these scandals struck you the hardest? Did one reveal a side of a legend you never expected? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective keeps the legacy of old Hollywood alive in all its brilliance and its darkness.